A somewhat dispiriting truth of the 21st century is that all around the world, mental well-being is at an all-time low. The aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic is somewhat bleak, with worldwide economic downturns that are still yet to be recovered from, along with a heightened sense of uncertainty, fear, and stress. Social media, despite its efforts to bring people together through technology, have largely exacerbated feelings of loneliness, inadequacy, and social isolation. These, along with many other factors, have led to a sharp decline in overall mental health, with significantly higher rates of anxiety and depression reported in comparison to previous decades. Mental well-being can be measured using numerical data. A common metric is the mental health quotient, or MHQ. This involves a series of questions or tasks designed to gauge various aspects of an individual's mental health, spitting out a number at the end. If the sample size is large enough, the MHQ can be used to evaluate the mental well-being of entire populations or nation-states, and this is exactly what's been done for the past 4 years, and the results of this year might surprise you. The study is conducted by the US-based non-profit Sapien Labs, with the goal of understanding the impact of a constantly evolving world on the human psyche. It examined factors such as mood, self-perception, drive, cognitive ability, and adaptability for 500,000 respondents across 71 countries. The higher the MHQ, the more satisfied the people. You might expect that the wealthier democratic nations would top the list, but you'd be wrong. In fact, the nations scoring the highest in 2023 were the Dominican Republic, Sri Lanka, and Tanzania, all of which are relatively small economies. Western nations such as the US, France, and Canada scored modestly, with the report concluding that, quote, greater wealth and economic development do not necessarily lead to greater mental well-being. Perhaps the most surprising or unsurprising of the results was that of the United Kingdom, which ranked second last at 70th in terms of overall MHQ, surpassed only by the Central Asian country of Uzbekistan, and even scored dead last in terms of percentage of those distressed or struggling. Even Yemen, a country that is suffering through one of the world's worst humanitarian crises of the 21st century, scored higher, whilst Ukraine, which is currently locked into Europe's biggest war since World War II, also came in comfortably higher. Despite its fall from grace, the UK is still one of the most developed nations of the 21st century. It's politically stable with a democratic governance and rule of law. Universal healthcare is offered to all its residents, employment prospects are also generally good, and the country is home to some of the most prestigious universities and educational institutions in the world. So why then does a country that is seemingly so prosperous score so unusually low in mental well-being? It's easy to blame it on the weather. After all, the country's island nature and its location at the edge of the Atlantic puts it directly in the path of both the jet and Gulf Streams, which significantly impacts weather patterns in the region. In essence, this means much more rainfall, less sunshine, and generally unpredictable conditions. But this is hardly where the story ends, and as is the case with pretty much every other modern country, the growing dissatisfaction and misery among the British populace runs deep into the country's socio-economic and political situation. For starters, the economy is not in a particularly good state. The country has endured 2 recessions in just 4 years, and since 2021, people across the country have been experiencing a cost of living crisis, with costs for everyday essentials such as food and bills increasing at a faster rate than the average household income. Rent prices have also skyrocketed, given that more people are moving into privately rented accommodation than ever before. The average household in the UK now spends 42% of their income post-tax on rent, which quickly rises to an astounding 72% in the country's capital. This is not to mention the low wages and lack of affordable housing across the country. People are getting poorer, and with inflation reaching a 41-year high, for many the situation looks as bleak as ever. The UK is also quite divided, and there's no better way of highlighting this than with Brexit, which to this day remains a controversial talking point across the country. In June of 2016, a referendum was held on whether the UK should stay as a member of the European Union, amid concerns regarding loss of national identity, immigration, and increasing bureaucracy in Brussels, which fueled a rise in Euroscepticism across the country. Despite the then Prime Minister David Cameron advocating for remaining in the EU, the referendum concluded with a slim victory for the Vote Leave campaign, with just over half of voters choosing to secede from the Union. And as you might expect, the decision opened a Pandora's box of problems, and explaining them in any detail could do with another video in and of itself. In essence, trade agreements between the UK and the European Union were scrapped, and the country's secession from the Single Markets and Customs Union made cross-border trade between the Isles and the mainland significantly more challenging and expensive. Industries that relied on easy cross-border trade and EU regulations, such as the automotive, agricultural and manufacturing sectors, along with financial services, suffered due to supply chain disruptions and economic uncertainty. The future of the UK as a union in and of itself was also brought into question. You see, the UK is made up of 4 constituent countries: England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And given England's substantially larger population compared to its 3 counterparts, the decision to leave Europe was largely an English one, despite the majority of people in Scotland and Northern Ireland choosing to stay. Discussions about Scottish independence thus began to resurface, given that 62% of voters in the country chose to remain in the EU. The Scottish Parliament, led by the Scottish National Party, or SNP, who strongly opposed the decision to leave, argued that Scotland's overwhelming vote to remain justified a second independence referendum. The first, which was held 10 years ago in 2014, saw 55% of Scottish voters in favour of remaining in the UK. If the second is ever to be held, which as of the making of this video hasn't, the outcome will likely be much closer and, if anything, slightly in favour of independence, given the less than favourable post-Brexit landscape. The more pressing issue, however, was just across the Irish Sea, amidst fears that the Good Friday Agreement was at risk. You see, the counties making up Northern Ireland were historically home to a majority Protestant population, with a substantial Catholic minority. Many of the Protestants were also Unionists, who were loyal to the British and wished to remain part of the UK. On the other hand, many of the Catholics identified as Irish nationalists, and sought reunification with the Republic of Ireland. Ethno-nationalistic tensions and discriminations against Catholics escalated to violence, and for the latter half of the 20th century, Northern Ireland entered a period now known as the Troubles, which saw the rise of the Irish Republican Army, or IRA, and various other paramilitary groups. The conflict was characterised by frequent massacres, shootings, bombings and assassinations, and saw thousands of people killed. In April of 1998, a peace accord, which became known as the Good Friday or Belfast Agreement, was finally reached by both the British and Irish governments, and helped to end 3 decades of paramilitary warfare and bloodshed. Brexit, however, undermined a fundamental aspect of this agreement. The Republic of Ireland is an EU member state, and the UK also being part of the EU meant that the movement of people and goods across the border could happen freely, without any strict regulations, customs checks and paperwork. The UK's secession from the European single market and customs union threatened the very nature of this, and opened the possibility of a hard border if no suitable arrangement could be negotiated beforehand. Were a hard border to be introduced, the delicate balance established back in 1998 would likely fall apart, reigniting ethnic tensions and violence across Northern Ireland. Unionist parties such as the DUP largely supported the choice to leave, whilst Irish nationalist parties such as Sinn Féin, who were linked to the provisional IRA during the Troubles, opposed it. Thankfully, a deal was struck between the UK government and the European Union after several failed negotiations. In what became known as the Northern Ireland Protocol, the treaty managed to avoid the introduction of a hard border on the island by instead creating a regulatory border in the Irish Sea and keeping some of the EU's rules and customs regulations in place on land. For now, Ireland remains peaceful, but the situation remains delicate, and the protocol remains a subject of controversy across the island, particularly among unionist politicians and communities, who feel it undermines Northern Ireland's position in the UK's internal market. What the British people can agree on, meanwhile, is that there is little trust to be had in the UK's political leadership, with nearly 9 in 10 people feeling that the government simply doesn't care about their concerns. Cuts to public spending in the form of austerity has led to an overall decline in pretty much everything. The UK's National Health Service, or NHS, has largely been left underfunded, with longer waiting times and staff shortages, not to mention poor working conditions, which has led to strikes that further compound the issue. Schools, infrastructure and public transports have generally gotten worse, and cuts to welfare benefits have driven up inequality and poverty, with food banks cropping up across the country. Chaos in Westminster also hasn't done much to improve faith in the government. The UK went through 4 different prime ministers in just 5 years, one of which lasted just 50 days, and a string of scandals within the ruling Conservative Party has also picked up significant media attention, arguably the most famous being Partygate. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the UK saw widespread lockdowns and public health restrictions which largely prohibited social gatherings of any kind. The government, meanwhile, had a different interpretation of their own rules, with reports of gatherings between Conservative Party loyalists surfacing during the 2021 holiday season. The then British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, denied that any such gatherings had taken place, and that rules had been followed. 2 months later, in January 2022, a full investigation by the Metropolitan Police concluded that the gatherings had in fact taken place, with evidence surfacing in a report showing parties at 10 Downing Street, with loyalists openly mocking the imposed regulations. The events of Partygate sparked public outrage, and ultimately led to Boris Johnson's downfall as Prime Minister and his eventual resignation as Member of Parliament. It'll certainly be interesting to see how the UK responds to all these challenges going forward, particularly with regards to economic uncertainty following a recession. A general election is scheduled to take place sometime in the next year and will undoubtedly bring about change, especially if the opposition party is voted in, but only time will tell. I hope you managed to learn a thing or two from this video. A lot of effort goes into making them, and if you haven't yet subscribed, now would be a good time to do so. Don't forget to also hit the notification bell so you don't miss any future content. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.